On this week's episode of Hot Cocoa, we give you the tool around Xcode and Interface Builder, play with some buttons, and let you in on the secret that Apple doesn't want you to know about its documentation. All this week on Hot Cocoa. In this first tutorial, we will be going over sort of an introduction to Xcode itself. How its interface works, where different things are, what some of the less useful things of it are, all the different things you can do with it, and also provide an introduction to Interface Builder, which is where you will be building how your application looks, and also linking buttons and stuff, but we'll get to the linking of buttons later. When you first open Xcode, you are presented with this pretty but essentially quite useless screen. And let me demonstrate just how useless it is, especially for beginners. You have this very friendly create your first Cocoa application, but when you click on it, it gives you the Xcode documentation, which is written by programmers for other programmers. It's not written for normal people who don't understand programmer speak, and even programmers who don't understand Apple. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you can read it, and if you want to choose a product template, it gives you a very sort of stating the obvious, sort of very complete list of every single thing you could possibly make in Xcode, instead of just telling you, you're probably going to want to make a Cocoa application. So we're not going to be using that, and you can probably make this not start at launch and be pretty safe. So we're going to create our first project, and when you create your first project, you'll be given this nice window of all the different things you can build in Xcode, and there are a ton of different things which you can build in Xcode. What we're going to be working in mostly is a Cocoa application and a Cocoa document application. I'll explain the difference between those two later. There's also core data applications, which are for database kind of things. You have, of course, Composer for fancy effects. Carbon, which is the old framework, which is based on C++ instead of Objective-C. And unfortunately, if you're a C++ programmer, or if you're porting your programs using C++, Apple is kind of leaving support for Carbon behind. When they provided 64-bit for Cocoa, they didn't do the same thing for Carbon, and they apparently don't plan to, which is why we don't have a 64-bit version of Photoshop on OS X yet, because it's all written in C++ and it's all written using Carbon. So if they want to use the 64-bit frameworks, they have to rewrite the whole thing using Cocoa, and that is a big job, because they have to retrain all the programmers and stuff. Anyway, that's why we don't have 64-bit Photoshop on OS X yet. See, if you have Xcode 3.1 or higher, but 3.1 is the highest when this came out, you can make iPhone applications which are organized into various sort of categories based on what they do, the flippy effects that they do, fancy flippy things. There's frameworks and command line utilities, basic console kind of stuff. But we want to make a Cocoa application, which is sort of the most generic interface based thing you can make on OS X. It's written in Objective-C, and it uses the Cocoa frameworks for drawing the interface. So we're going to create our first project, and we shall call this, I guess we can call it Hello World. I'm not going to program the Hello World part, but it's traditional. There we go. And that'll create a folder wherever you chose to save it. So wherever you chose to save it, it's going to make a folder and then put all of your stuff in that folder. The default location to put it in case you lose stuff, is in your home folder, which is just your name, and in this case, there's the folder it made, Hello World. And here's all of the files, just sort of to give you an overview of what each thing is, in case you need to open it later. This is the Xcode project. This is what you'll open if you actually want to open the project. This is your source code, or one of them. You can add more later, and you probably will. In here, this is where all the localization stuff goes, and also where the main menu.zib file, which I'll go into a little bit more in a second. That's the interface. And then build, which is where your application will be once it's been built. So looking at the Xcode window here, you have a list of folders here, some of which real folders, some of which not. If they were actual folders, they'd be a different color. These are folders that created. And then over here, we have a listing of files, and then down here, where you have an editor for the source code. So if you click on a source code item, there's the source code. And there's two ways you can edit the source code. If you double click on it, it'll open in a separate window. Personally, I like to reduce desktop clutter, and if you're working on a lot of code files, you'll end up with a lot of open windows. So the easiest way is just, if you click this, that'll get rid of that top part. You can always click it to bring it back, but that gets rid of that. So you have plenty of open space here. And then you can go over here, and let's see, where would that be? Nope. Yeah, there it is. Other sources, main.m. And this is what we're looking at now. Normally you won't edit it, you'll create another one, and that's for a later tutorial. Also another handy button, this one. This one doesn't do anything at the moment because there's no header file for main. But once we get into header files, this button right here will be very useful because it switches between the main and the header. And you don't have to do it yourself, because that can be really annoying. Now, into Interface Builder we go. Within your project, within every project, you'll have at least one, if you're making a Vue-based application, you'll have at least one zib file. Now, in previous versions of Xcode, these were called nib files. They're pretty much exactly the same thing. The only difference is nib is a binary format, meaning it's already compiled. If you opened it, you'd see a bunch of garbage that isn't human readable. Only the compiler understands it. Zib is basically the XML equivalent of that. So if you actually went and opened this, like if you opened it as a plain text file, you can see all of that lovely XML in there, which you will probably never edit by yourself. But what we want to do is we want to open it in Interface Builder. Which, if you've gone and told it to open it as a source file, the only way to get it to open it in Interface Builder by double clicking it is to right click on it and then go to Open with Finder. So here we have our application open in Interface Builder, and the screen is getting a little cluttered, so let's hide Xcode and sort of spread things out a bit here so we can show what each thing is. Alright, some things are sort of obvious. There's the menu over here. Right here you have the actual window. This is where you'll stick buttons and whatever you want the user to see. Over here we have the document window. This is where all of the stuff that is part of the zib file, but not graphical, meaning it won't show up when the user sees the interface. And there you can put objects and array controllers, the stuff that handles the communication between the buttons on the interface and the code back end. Over here we have the attributes window, which I'll show you more of in a second, and then the library. And the library is where you get all the pretty looking Cocoa buttons and stuff, everything that makes OS X look nice. So let's see, we will add a button to the form, and button. And there are many different kinds of buttons: push buttons, gradient buttons, rounded rectangular buttons, recess buttons, texture buttons, rounded texture buttons, square buttons, bevel buttons, round buttons. Tons and tons of buttons. There's even cells, which we'll get into later. We're just going to use a regular one because it's cool looking. There's some other cool looking. I like this one, but you can use them for different things. They look appropriate in different contexts. there's probably something in the Apple interface, human interface guidelines about it. I've never read them. So make what looks nice. If it looks funky, then you're probably doing it wrong. Now, the attributes window. This is where you can see all of the various different things you can do to make the button look different, and also to make the button interact with the code differently. This first tab here is the attributes section. Oh, by the way, if you don't see this window, I don't know if it's open by default, but it's under Tools Inspector. This window itself is called the Inspector, and it's got all these tabs here. So the first tab is called Attributes, and this is basically sort of the attributes of the button, like the title, like my cool button, and that's what's going to show up on the button itself. There we go. And the alternate title, my cool alternate title, and that's what'll show up when someone hovers over the button. Image, you can stick an image onto the button like that. Ta-da! And then alt image is sort of the same thing, it's just the alt title. Scaling, that changes the scaling of the images. This is where you can change for all the different styles of buttons. You can either set it there or just grab them from the library. They're all derivatives of NS button, which if you see right here, and see, they're all NS buttons. All these different looking things are all just different forms of the exact same thing. And we have sound. You can make it have a sound when you click on it. You can set a key equivalent, so when someone clicks a certain key, that button will be pushed. Text stuff. If you happen to have a language that reads right to left, you can set it that. You can make it disabled, gray it out so people can't click it. Enabled, it comes back on. And view stuff, which, to be honest, I don't really know what that does. Hidden makes it so you can't see it. When the interface is displayed to the user, if it's set as hidden, they will not see it at all. It's marked as transparent here, so you can still see it to edit it. Button effects. This is core animation stuff. It lets you do cool looking, effects and stuff. Let's see. What's something cool we can do to it? We can invert the color on it. Ooh, now we have a black button. And you can make it clear. And these are all controllable within the programming code. And in order to have it do all that stuff, you'll need to enable animations by just clicking this checkbox. Otherwise, it won't do anything, and it'll say enable core animation rendering because you're trying to do stuff that you can't without doing that. The size tab lets you control the size for buttons, and you can only really drag them out horizontally. If you want to make the button actually smaller, and this holds true for a lot of elements, you can't shrink it per se, but you can switch to a smaller version of it. So it actually gets skinnier, and you can see you have the different sizes: regular, small, and mini. And that holds true for a lot of other elements like scroll bars. They also have mini versions of it. You've probably seen it in like Adyen's contact list, for one example, uses the smaller version, just for different things for different purposes. Auto resizing. This basically, if you look here, you can see how these are the anchor points on the outside here, and this will show you how it will. Yeah, you can't do that because it's a button. If it was something that you could resize vertically, you could enable this, and it would stretch as you stretch the window form out. And then you have, basic sort of text stuff, alignment and placement. Here we have the bindings. This is all sort of advanced stuff. This is how you link it to controller code and stuff. Connections. This is where you can connect the button to code to make it do stuff, and connect code to the button so they can talk back and forth to each other. And we will go into that when we write our first application. And then the button identity, which right here would be listed all the actions that the button could perform, all the outlets, which is basically how you talk back to the button, and basically what class it's a subclass of, in which case this is a nice button because it's a button. And then AppleScript, if you want to, you can add like AppleScript commands in there as well. So that's pretty much it. Let's see if we go back into Xcode. Make sure I haven't forgotten anything. There's a few more things over here. Targets, these are different versions of your applications. For example, if you don't want to burden your users with having to download a universal binary version, which is typically, depending on the program, it can be up to twice as large as one that's made for a specific processor, Intel or PowerPC. You can make different targets, set up different settings, have them come out differently without having to change different things. Build configurations, debug and release. Release, basically, it removes all the debug symbols, makes it compile faster, and makes it run faster because it's not having to try and link with the debugger. Basically strips out stuff the end user won't need. That's pretty much it for the basic stuff, which we're going to go over here. In the next tutorial, we will be building our first application, where we will actually be able to get to write some code and do some linking and get everything to work together and be all happy. Next week on Hot Cocoa.